You're a warrior captured on a foreign shore. The battle is over. Your shield is shattered, your sword lost. Now you're on your knees, hands bound, cold sand grinding into your skin. Before you stands the Viking chieftain whose father you killed in the chaos of the raid. His eyes aren't filled with simple anger. They hold something deeper, something colder. A promise of a vengeance so profound it will be sung about for 1,000 years. He isn't just going to kill you. He's going to make you into a message. This is the world of the Norsemen, the Viking Age, a period from the late 8th to the late 11th centuries. We remember them for their longships, their epic voyages, their sagas of heroes and gods, but behind the popular image of adventurous explorers and noble warriors lay a reality far more brutal, governed by a code of honor and revenge that could demand acts of unimaginable cruelty. These weren't random acts of battlefield savagery. They were part of a system of belief and retribution, a form of psychological warfare so extreme it has been debated by historians for centuries. What you're about to discover comes directly from the Vikings' own stories, their sagas and skaldic poetry, as well as the painstaking analysis of archaeologists and scholars who have tried to separate myth from a horrifying reality. The administrative records of their victims and the anatomical studies of today both paint a grim picture. What they reveal is a ritualized weapon of vengeance, a practice so ghastly it feels like it belongs to the realm of mythology, a practice known as the Blood Eagle. But before we continue, if you enjoy dark and forgotten history, consider subscribing and letting us know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us know how far these lost stories are traveling. Let's begin with the ritual itself. The Blood Eagle was not a simple execution. If the sagas are to be believed, it was a deeply symbolic and religious ceremony, a sacrifice offered to the god of war and death, Odin. It was reserved for the most hated of enemies, for those who had committed an unforgivable offense against a powerful family, typically the murder of a father or chieftain. Its purpose was twofold: to inflict the maximum possible suffering on the victim, and to create a terrifying spectacle that would cement the executioner's reputation for all time. The process, as described in Norse literature, is stomach-churning in its clinical detail. The victim was first restrained, often tied to a pillar or forced face down onto the ground. Their back was then marked, the shape of an eagle's wings outlined on their skin. The executioner, using a knife or even a sword, would begin by cutting deep into the flesh, slicing through the layers of muscle. But this was just the beginning. The true horror lay in the next step. The ribs were severed from the spinal column, one by one, and then brutally pried outwards, breaking them to create a pair of gruesome, bloody wings. The final act was the most horrific. Through this gaping wound in the victim's back, the lungs were pulled out of the body cavity. According to some poetic accounts, the victim, if still alive, would experience their last breaths as a gentle fluttering of these exposed lungs, supposedly resembling the weak beating of wings. Salt was then, allegedly, poured into the massive wound. It was an execution designed to erase a person from existence in the most agonizing way conceivable, turning their body into a monument of their own destruction. It was the ultimate expression of power, a statement that the executioner's vengeance was so absolute it could deconstruct a human being. But who deserved such a fate? The sagas, our primary source for these events, name specific victims. These weren't common criminals. They were kings and powerful chieftains, men whose deaths demanded an equally powerful response. The most famous account involves the legendary Viking hero, Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the sagas, Ragnar was captured by Ella, the king of Northumbria in modern-day England, and executed by being thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. Ragnar's sons, who included figures like Ivar the Boneless and Bjorn Ironside, swore a terrible oath of revenge. They raised the great heathen army, invaded England, and, after capturing King Ella, subjected him to the Blood Eagle. The tale of Ragnar's sons, a 13th century saga, describes it bluntly. It says they carved the blood eagle on his back, a phrase that has haunted the imagination ever since. In this context, the eagle wasn't just a random symbol of cruelty, it was a direct, symbolic response. Ella had used serpents of the earth to kill their father, so they would use an eagle of the air to unmake him. Another detailed account appears in the Orkneyinga saga. It tells of the feud between the sons of the Norwegian king, Harald Fairhair. One son, Halfdan Hallig, murdered Ragnvald. Eysteinsson, the Earl of Møre, a close ally of the king. In retaliation, Ragnvald's son, Torf Einar, captured Halfdan. The saga provides a chillingly detailed description. Einar's men held Halfdan down while Einar himself performed the execution. The saga states he cut the blood eagle on his back by laying a sword to his spine and cutting all his ribs down to his loins and then pulling out his lungs. It even adds a detail that Einar dedicated his victim to Odin as a sacrifice for his own victory. These stories, and a few other more ambiguous references, form the entirety of the written evidence. They are consistent in their narrative. A grievous insult, a vow of revenge, and a ritualistic eagle-shaped execution dedicated to the chief of the Norse gods. For centuries, these accounts were taken more or less at face value, as proof of the Vikings' legendary barbarity. But modern history is a science of skepticism. And when historians began to look closer at the documentation, a fierce debate erupted. A debate over whether the blood eagle ever truly happened at all. This brings us to the great historical debate. On one side, we have scholars who argue the blood eagle was nothing more than a myth, a literary invention born from a misunderstanding. The most influential proponent of this theory was the scholar Roberta Frank. In a landmark 1984 paper, she argued that Christian authors, writing centuries after the Viking Age and eager to portray the pagan Norsemen as monstrous, misinterpreted complex Old Norse poetry. The key phrase, "to carve an eagle on a back," she suggested, was a poetic metaphor known as a kenning. It didn't mean a literal surgical procedure. It simply meant to kill an enemy in battle and leave their corpse on the field for a real eagle, a carrion bird, to tear apart with its claws and beak. In this view, the carving was done by the eagle's claws, not a human's knife. The vivid, gruesome details found in later sagas were, according to this argument, embellishments that grew over time, like a fish story, with each retelling adding a more horrific layer. Frank points out that the earliest poems mentioning the practice are incredibly vague, while the most graphic, detailed descriptions come from much later Christian sources. Furthermore, there is a complete lack of archaeological evidence. We have Viking burial sites, battlefields, and settlements. We have skeletons that show evidence of brutal battle wounds, but we have never found a single skeleton with its ribs severed from the spine in the manner the sagas describe. For many historians, this absence of physical proof, combined with the poetic ambiguity of the earliest sources, is damning. The blood eagle, they conclude, was a powerful piece of anti-pagan propaganda and a gory literary trope, not a real historical practice. But that's not the end of the story. Other historians push back, arguing that to dismiss the blood eagle entirely is to ignore the context in which these stories were written. They argue that the descriptions, particularly in the case of Torf Einar, are too specific and clinical to be purely metaphorical. Why would a saga writer invent such a complex and anatomically precise method of execution if it wasn't based on something real, even if it was exceptionally rare? These scholars suggest that while the stories were certainly written down later, they were based on a deeply ingrained oral tradition, one that remembered the most extreme acts of ancestral vengeance. The lack of archaeological evidence isn't surprising. A victim of the blood eagle would likely not have been given a formal burial. Their body was a spectacle, meant to be left to rot in the open as a warning. And even if they were buried, the fine cut marks on ribs might be difficult to distinguish from other forms of post-mortem damage after 1,000 years in the soil. This side of the argument asks us to consider the culture itself, the Viking. World was one where honor and reputation were everything, and where blood feuds could span generations. The sagas are filled with tales of spectacular, inventive, and cruel acts of revenge. Was the blood eagle really so much more unbelievable than other documented brutalities of the age? They argue that just because it was horrific doesn't mean it didn't happen. It may have been the exception, not the rule, but that doesn't make it a fiction. This leads us to a fundamental question. Even if it was just a story, why was this the story they told? What does it say about the culture that could invent and believe in such a practice? The answer lies in the core tenets of the Norse worldview: the inescapable importance of honor, the sacred duty of vengeance, and the terrifying nature of their gods. In the Viking Age, your honor, or heder, was your most valuable possession. It was your standing in the community, your reputation, your very sense of self. To be without honor was to be a Nidinger, a social outcast, less than human. Insults, especially those against your family, were deep wounds to your honor that had to be avenged. The legal systems of the time, like those found in the Icelandic Gragas or Grey Goose laws, had formal procedures for dealing with injury and murder, often involving fines called wergild or man money. But for the most profound insults, for the murder of a father by a rival king, paying a fine was not enough. It was seen as weak. Honor demanded a response in blood. This is the root of the blood feud, a cycle of retaliatory killing that could tear families apart for generations. The sagas are essentially family histories, and they are driven by the engine of the blood feud. The blood eagle, in this context, represents the feud's ultimate endpoint. It's a form of vengeance so total and devastating that it ends the cycle because there can be no possible response. How do you avenge an act designed to be the final word in cruelty? And at the center of this world of warrior honor was the god Odin. Odin was not a benevolent, fatherly figure. He was the All-Father, yes, but he was also the god of frenzy, of betrayal, of poetry, and of the dead. He was a god of war who did not value a fair fight. He valued victory at any cost. He was known as the Terrible One, the father of the slain, and he demanded sacrifice. While large-scale human sacrifice was likely rare in the Viking Age, smaller-scale ritual killings, especially of prisoners of war, are well documented in historical accounts and supported by archaeological finds like the bog bodies of northern Europe. These sacrifices were often dedicated to Odin, a gift of the slain in exchange for victory in battle. The account of Torf Einar explicitly states he dedicated Halfdan to Odin. In this light, the blood eagle transforms from simple revenge into a horrific act of religious piety. It is the executioner giving the most extreme gift he can conceive, to the most demanding of gods. The victim isn't just killed, they are offered up, their body reshaped into a symbol fit for a dark deity. So, the cultural framework existed, a society obsessed with honor, driven by blood feuds and worshipping a god who reveled in death and sacrifice. This was the fertile ground in which the idea of the blood eagle, real or imagined, could grow. But this still leaves a lingering, practical question. Could it even be done? Is the procedure described in the sagas anatomically possible? For a long time, the answer was assumed to be no. The sheer trauma would kill a person long before their lungs could be pulled out. It seemed like a medical fantasy. However, a 2022 study by medical scientists and historians from the University of Kiel in England revisited this question using modern anatomical knowledge and sophisticated modeling software. Their conclusion was chilling. The study found that the procedure was, from a medical standpoint, entirely possible. A person could remain alive, though in unimaginable agony and shock, through the severing of the ribs. The researchers concluded that the victim would have died very quickly once their lungs were exposed and the chest cavity collapsed, meaning the final image of flapping wings was a poetic exaggeration. But the core of the ritual, the carving, the breaking of the ribs, the removal of the lungs, was, according to their analysis, anatomically feasible. This research doesn't prove the blood eagle happened, but it does remove a major argument against it. It demonstrates that it wasn't a physical impossibility. The Vikings, with their known skill in using sharp blades and their intimate knowledge of animal butchery, would have possessed the grim capability to carry it out. The study adds a new layer of plausibility to the sagas, suggesting that what we might dismiss as fantasy was, in fact, within the realm of the horribly real. This leads us to consider the scale and purpose of the ritual. If the blood eagle did happen, it was clearly not a common event. It's mentioned only a handful of times across the entire corpus of Norse literature. It wasn't a standard form of execution or a legal punishment. It was an anomaly, an event of extreme rarity. But that rarity was precisely the point. Its power wasn't in its frequency. Its power was in its symbolism. It was a weapon of terror. In an age before mass media, a leader's reputation was built on stories. A chieftain who was known to have performed the blood eagle on arrival would possess a fearsome aura. It was a story that would travel by word, of mouth, carried by traders and warriors from fjord to fjord. It was a message to any other potential rival. This is what happens when you cross me. It was a form of psychological warfare designed to terrify enemies into submission and inspire awe and fear in followers. The story of the blood eagle was, in itself, a weapon. Whether Ivar the Boneless actually performed it on King Ella is, in some ways, secondary to the fact that he became known as the man who would. The legend became a strategic asset. By being associated with an act of such ultimate ritualized cruelty, a Viking leader could project an image of absolute and divinely sanctioned power. It was a way to rise above the petty squabbles of lesser chieftains and become a figure of legend. This taps into what we might call the economics of reputation. In Viking society, wealth was not just measured in silver, land, and ships. It was measured in influence, loyalty, and fame. A strong reputation, or drakila, meaning dragon slaying or great renown, was a currency more valuable than gold. It attracted the best warriors to your longship, secured favorable alliances, and deterred attacks. How did you acquire such a reputation? Through great deeds, winning battles, exploring new lands, and, most importantly, avenging your kin in a memorable way. Investing in one's reputation could mean undertaking a dangerous voyage or commissioning. A great poem from a skald to celebrate your victories. And for the most ambitious, it could mean orchestrating an act of vengeance so spectacular it would never be forgotten. The blood eagle, in this cold economic light, can be seen as the ultimate investment in one's personal brand. It cost the life of one enemy, but the return was a legacy of terror and respect that could pay dividends for years, ensuring the security of your family and your lands. It was a brutal calculation, where an act of supreme violence generated a fortune in political and social capital. So where does this leave the blood eagle? A literary myth? A factual, if rare, ritual? The answer, frustratingly, remains uncertain. The evidence is forever trapped in a gray area between lurid story and plausible horror. But its legacy is undeniable. Over the centuries, the blood eagle has detached from its complicated historical context and has become a simple, powerful symbol of Viking savagery. Popular culture, from television shows to video games, has seized upon the image. It is often presented without the historical debate, without the cultural context of honor and religion. It is shown as a common practice, a go-to move for any angry Viking, which it most certainly was not. The blood eagle has become a piece of cultural shorthand, a quick and easy way to signal that the Vikings were brutal. It serves our modern appetite for grim and gritty history, but it also flattens a complex culture into a caricature. The real story, with its layers of poetry, honor, religious fervor, and scholarly debate, is far more interesting than the monster myth it has become. In the end, the true horror of the blood eagle may not lie in the question of whether a man's lungs were ever pulled through his back. The horror lies in the fact that a society imagined it. They conceived of it, wrote it down, and told it as a story of righteous, heroic vengeance. Whether fact or fiction, the blood eagle gives us a stark window into the Norse psyche, into a world where the lines between warrior, poet, and priest could blur, and where vengeance could be elevated to the level of sacred art. The story of this ritual forces us to confront the profound darkness that can exist within any human culture, hidden behind codes of honor and religious devotion. It's a powerful reminder that the most terrifying weapons are not always made of steel, but are sometimes forged from ideas, from the beliefs that allow human beings to see an act of ultimate cruelty not as a crime, but as a duty. Understanding. This history, in all its brutal ambiguity, is not about judging the past. It's about recognizing the terrifying logic that can lead people to commit the unthinkable, and understanding that the capacity for such things is a part of the human story we ignore at our own peril.